Hello? Yeah. I think we can start, right? Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to this penultimate session of this very inspiring conference, which is almost looking like an Olympic marathon in the last few hours. So my name is Giuliano Martiniello. Very briefly, I'm assistant professor at the American University of Beirut. So today I'll be chairing this session titled Powerful Categories, where we'll be talking about, again, an ongoing debate over measures and categories. Our two panelists, Karen Rignall, who is an assistant professor at the College of Agriculture, University of Kentucky. She's been working on issues of agrarian change and land tenure system, so she will be the first presenter. And then we'll have Zakaria Kadiri, professor of sociology at the University of Casablanca. Zakaria is working on himself on issues of agrarian change and natural resources management, especially water and land. So you can... Sorry?
We just want to regret the absence of our colleague Hania Sholkami, who was due to give a paper, The Poorest Are the Most in Need, and had an accident that has prevented her from being able to be with us, but she will be sending her paper, and we hope to include her for the future.
Great. Okay, thanks. So the session will go on still for 1.5 hours, right? So you have more or less 20...
Slightly shorter, so that we have more time.
Yeah, so should we keep it more time for the discussion, or how do you prefer? 20? Okay, okay, 20 minutes, whatever you feel like. Okay, go on. Right.
Thank you all. This has been a very, very rich conference, and I really appreciate the chance to be here with all of you, and really want to thank the organizers. This has been wonderful. It's a real privilege for me to present on work in progress. This is research that I'm writing up with a collaborator, actually, who's an agricultural economist also at the University of Kentucky. So I'm a cultural anthropologist. I'm an ethnographer, but what I will be talking about today is perhaps a little more quantitative or a little more, let's say, methodologically rigid than I normally do, but I wanted to relate it more broadly to debates around land tenure. And we haven't talked a tremendous amount about land tenure, and so perhaps this can be one entree into that question. In particular, this is going to highlight the incredible diversity of land tenure regimes in the region, because I think some of the issues regarding Moroccan land tenure you don't find, you perhaps used to find in Syria, but maybe not so much anymore. So I'm entitled The Shadow Land Governance, and I'll get to what that means. And I'm interested in particular on kind of customary land tenure, and Africanness in the room will sort of recognize this as a major issue throughout the continent, but perhaps less so in the Middle East. And I'm trying to think through how customary land tenure has managed some pretty marked social and economic transformations in the land use situation in Southeast Morocco, and as well on issues of poverty. Oops, wrong computer. I first presented this research this past March, actually at a World Bank conference. So I am an anthropologist, and so I wanted to get the latest thinking on land tenure, and I figured the best way to do that was to go to the belly of the beast. And so they have an annual conference called the World Bank Conference on Land and Poverty, and I highly recommend it because it was fascinating. And I did some participatory observation, and it was quite fascinating. And I found that the conference itself has become part of my research. So it has now folded into this work, because what I was very struck by is something that I was sort of vaguely familiar with. It's been some time since the World Bank has promoted exclusive private titling as its policy. It's been, I don't know, maybe 15 years or so. And now the conventional wisdom is to speak about pluralistic land regimes and recognizing collective tenure regimes or customary regimes, which are not always collective, but recognizing those through kind of creative titling schemes. But what is interesting is even though the sort of thrust of that conference and a lot of land tenure debates right now is about how you can recognize formally and juridically these collective tenure regimes, it's also a debate that's happening in the context of land grabbing, financialization, and unprecedented levels of investment in land. And to have these two discussions happen simultaneously is very interesting and produces a lot of sort of troubling contradictions. So the two, I picked up a lot of great language at the conference, including the sort of major theme is this idea of scaling up responsible land governance. And so the idea of land governance is that in recognizing groups' collective tenure, and that may mean ownership or may mean just use rights, what you're trying to do is recognize their existing rights in a prevailing plural legal regime. Now again, this may not apply to sort of many of the contexts in which you all work. In Morocco, it's huge, but even if collective land tenure isn't as widespread as it used to be in the Middle East, plural regimes most definitely are, because every regime is plural, if only because of the sort of disjuncture between practice and law and politics. So the idea of securing land rights in this sort of prevailing regime is also interesting because of its essentially conservative nature. There's no real reform agenda. It's not about improving access of people to land. It's about securing existing rights. But there was also this lovely phrase called fit-for-purpose land administration. And this idea, as the sort of caption there reads, is that land administration needs to be all of these things that we think it should be. It should be inclusive, it should be participatory, reliable, it should be something that you can actually administer and do so in an institutionally sort of rational way, and you need to scale it up. And so as an aside, this isn't part of the research, there's a big data effort going on also with some of the land administration. Now, it's telling that this fit-for-purpose concept comes from consumer protection law, actually, that it's a phrase about consumer protection fitting the purpose of both promoting sort of the free circulation of commodities, but also consumer rights. Because at the end of the day, even this sort of new recognition of group rights is still within a market-based framework. And the idea is to protect smallholders through kind of accountable, transparent administration regimes, but it's to enable them to fulfill the economic potential in their lands. And these are often marginal lands. So it's about finding new forms of economic value in land that hadn't been commoditized or hadn't had various forms of sort of quantifiable value associated with it. But there's a bigger goal, and I'll eventually get to Morocco, I promise, is to promote the overall investment potential of these lands, lands that have ambiguous tenure status or plural regimes. And so in this context, transparency, rule of law, investment has a way of turning this land and of rendering it more open to external acquisition. It makes it more legible. It makes it more amenable to outside appropriation. So these are some of the contradictory outcomes that can result from this effort. And people who have had their customary land rights sort of challenged are obviously, there are important social mobilizations happening in many parts of the world for people to have those rights recognized. So many people do indeed want their rights recognized. But on the other hand, this sort of appropriation into these other processes or regarding financialization and land investment make it problematic. But then there's a sort of bigger question as well, is that this policy begs the question of what a customary tenure regime is and how we know one when we see it. And that's a very, very thorny question because as Roland was raising it with Mandate Syria, and 1919 was a very significant year in Morocco, because what came to define a customary tenure regime was usually defined by colonial authority. And in this case, it was designed by the French Protectorate Authority in a 1919 decree that formally recognized collective lands as belonging to tribal confederations, but under the tutelage of the Bureau des Affaires Indigènes and the Protectorate regime. So in essence, it subsumed collective tenure regimes under the colonial authority. And that is the system that continues today. It is essentially unchanged, except that the Ministry of Interior is the Bureau des Affaires Indigènes in more ways than one, I think. So what we have to pay attention to on a sort of empirical basis for Morocco, but just in general, when we see these debates, even elsewhere, is that what's described as a customary tenure regime is often based on these inherited colonial notions, or other ways in which customary regimes have been folded into the sort of apparatus and space of the state, and so don't necessarily operate in a truly customary way. So then you have this shadow regime. So you have these sort of the formal customary regime, but then you actually have the way in which people manage their land. And that's what I've been trying to get at with some of my research, is that we have a very rigid structure in certain respects for a collective land administration in Morocco. But then we actually have the ways in which groups in the South have been managing their land. And so I came to the question of how we can start to capture this, because I do so qualitatively in my work. I have a very strong sense of, over the past 60 years, how people have been managing their land. But I'm also interested in, given the invisibility of these tenure regimes and the invisibility statistically of these populations who don't appear, their agricultural production's too low, their land ownership's too low, and their land tenure status is not even recognized, because there is privately held land in these areas. It's just you can't get title to it. So I came at this with some broader research questions, because I'm really interested in livelihood transition, and I'll get into what that was. And I was interested in how livelihood transitions have affected land use, and also how customary tenure affected this livelihood transition, and how, in fact, this sort of integration of a region that was isolated in certain respects into kind of national and global markets has, in fact, increased the importance of customary land tenure, not decreased it. And I think that's true in a number of places, is that customary land tenure then becomes an even more important arbiter as market-based production starts happening on some of these lands. So briefly, where I work is in a pre-Saharan oasis. It's the Magoun Valley, in that little red box. It's in the rain shadow of the Atlas Mountains. So it's the sort of second to last string of oases before you get to the hyper-aridity of the desert. And so this valley extends from the kind of mountains down to the Sahara Mountains. And it is one of the few areas that has a river that runs all year and has oasis agriculture, as you can see there. That was taken in kind of early spring, so you have the almond trees that are starting to blossom at that point. And I can talk about the farming system a little bit later if you are interested. I can talk about the farming system forever. But, so this is an oasis valley. It's surrounded by the arid steppe. It's not Arab. This is a Shilha, Tashalhait, Berber area. And it was dominated by extensive pastoralism, transhumans who moved their herds up and down these mountains, and then intensive oasis agriculture. But there's been a marked shift over the past half century. It's a marginalized region, chronically poor, and labor migration has been a real lifeline for the region. And so from the 60s on, labor migrants went to, the mines in France and Holland and elsewhere in Morocco. So indeed, like in most places, it's very diversified livelihoods and wage-based. But importantly, and something that I want to keep on coming back to in my work, is that people are investing in land, they are investing in agriculture, and it's a very important part not only of their identities, but of their whole livelihood systems. So you can see, though, the kinds of changes that I'm talking about are very visible on the landscape, in the sense that when people have invested in land, they are sometimes bringing new land into production. So I have Al Bor and Neit Yahya and Al Hart. Those two sort of swaths of green didn't exist 40 years ago. What people have done is extended irrigation canals. And this is somewhat different than some of the extensions of agriculture you see elsewhere in Morocco, which are done by deep wells, is that this is done by the surface irrigation off of the sort of traditional seguias, so it hasn't had the same impact on the water table. So I was interested in how people are accessing this land and how this overall transition has happened, because with a chronic drought worsening and the commoditization of the livestock sector, extensive pastoralism is essentially no longer a viable livelihood. And so what we've had is a real shift in populations. Let me spend just a quick moment talking about what customary tenure is here. A brief moment, because I told Juliana I only wanted 20 minutes, but clearly I'm going to go over. These are nested or intertwining collective and private property regimes, and they always have been. There's milk, but there's also different kinds of collective regimes at different scales. There are tribal confederations that extend over whole valleys and whole regions where people used to move their herds, but then there are also collective holdings at the village level, and these are governed by different kinds of mechanisms that sometimes relate to one another and sometimes don't. And they, as in most places, are linked with other forms of natural resource governance, as well as local governance in general. So the Jma, the local councils that were administering land, used to just administer everything. They still have they still have a sort of political identity indirectly in land governance, but it's not a formal government position. And we could talk a little bit more about the sort of ambiguous administrative status of some of these regimes. But crucially for my story here is a notion of you being native versus non-native and how that affects your rights. Again, this is pretty reminiscent of many places in sub-Saharan Africa. And if you are kind of native to this region and to the tribal confederation, then you would have collective land rights, and then you can access land through a non-market allocation. You go to your land representative and you'd say, I'd like to get some land. If you're non-native, you can buy land, actually. There is private property, but you cannot buy agricultural land. And that has had implications for this transition that I'm going to talk about. So what happened? We had this shift, and so just what this picture shows is one of the extensions. As people are bringing new land into cultivation, they are leveling the land. This takes many years to do, is that usually they start off planting some olive trees, they put in alfalfa for a number of years and manure, and you're not expecting returns for upwards of a decade, depending on how rushed you are. And so this is one example of a relatively new addition in El Hart. That was one of my major field sites. So what we had here is large population movements up from the mountains of pastoralists who could no longer do livestock production. And they came down to the steppe, the lower part of the valley that I showed you, for wage labor, and to a certain extent, some cultivation, but usually as agricultural labor and as sharecroppers. And so what there has been is a transition from extensive pastoralism to housing and cultivation, and a certain level of extension. So these are the walls that people will put into land that they're claiming or that they've gotten allocations from, and I'll describe what I'm doing with that soon. So what you have is this sort of shadow customary regime, in the sense that it's it's the real working of customary tenure, because the formal customary tenure regime is this sort of ossified system where you don't divide land formally, at least in this area, because it was delimited. There's been a lot of collective land divisions elsewhere in Morocco, and we can talk about that. But what happened is that customary tenure leaders were essentially rationing land as to who could move where land could be bought. Land is zoned. You can't, unlike Egypt, you can't build on agricultural land. I'm sure it's happened, but it's not common. You only build, it's a gravity irrigation regime, so you only build over above the seguias. And so what happened is sort of immigrant populations are sort of moved into the areas where they can buy land for housing and where they can become wage labor in Moroccan cities and locally. So what I was trying to do with my colleague is I've got a story to tell about this. I've seen it happen, but is there any way in which we could capture this in data in a way that could sort of show how this is actually working? So I did extensive field work, and then we did, and that was in 2010 on through, and then we did a household survey in 2014, and it was with over 300 households, and what we did is we did a sort of proxy, a sort of longitudinal panel study, I guess, where we collected data on household assets and demographics and livelihoods in 1960, which was before the emigration started. And then we did the same with much more variables in 2014. Now, this is obviously recall data, as we're talking to people about what their father, and it usually was a father, but we also had female-headed households here, and we captured women's land ownership as well. People know how much land they own and how much land their neighbors own. So obviously this may not be totally accurate, but when land and livestock were really the only assets you could own at this time, it was not a really monetized economy, I feel like we got fairly good orders of magnitude, and so we were able to make this comparison between what your status was in 1960 and then what it is in the present. And so we were able to document this livelihood transition, which again sort of seems obvious once you are just sort of telling the story. But we were able to kind of document it in sort of people's livelihood profiles, where agriculture and livestock production were the predominant livelihoods as sort of everyone understood them at the the sort of pre-migration period, and now it's obviously a whole lot more diversified, and there are some differences with the kind of native and non-native households, and we define native and non-native as by whether or not they had land rights in the community where they were living. So everyone here was Moroccan from the area, but it was whether or not you had collective land rights. And so agriculture is still important, but it really is about wage labor as being the backbone of people's livelihoods. And where there's an interesting difference here is the native households are able to get into higher skilled and higher paying wage labor jobs. And we can get into why. There are a number of reasons. It's not simply because of your land tenure status. Whereas non-native are doing the day labor, manual labor, and they are doing paid or crop share or sharecropping more than natives because they are coming in at the lowest rung of the socioeconomic ladder, and they're starting to sharecrop for native households, whereas those native households, and there's a racial dynamic here as well, which I could get into in another time. It was racially black communities were usually indentured sharecroppers, and they sort of started to refuse to do that. So there's a social issue involved in not wanting to be sharecropping, whereas the new immigrants are in fact Imazighen, they're white, but they're forced by their socioeconomic status to sharecrop. And so we started, we're going to play with the data, but we did see some meaningful differences, however, in the livelihood possibilities, the asset ownership, and the different kinds of agriculture that you did based on your sort of land access and land tenure. There were meaningful differences in your land ownership. You owned more land. The asher is the local land measure. It's a 40th of a hectare. And other differences were in education level. So overall educational attainment in this area is fairly low. But if you could complete middle school, that's a good it's a good marking off point of the kinds of livelihoods it opens up to you. So you can get your driver's license, which is a huge boost. So you could drive a taxi, for instance, and if you had a middle school education, and a couple of other assets. You more likely to own a vehicle if you're native. You're more likely to have skilled workers in your household if you're native, and you're going to have a higher income. Now, obviously, there's a lot that's going on here. These differences may be due to a number of things. It could be due towards their immigrant status as opposed to just their land tenure status. Thank you. And we need to think about bias in sample selection, but I'm feeling really good about how we did our sample, and I could get into that. I'm very proud of it because I'm an anthropologist and we don't do things like that usually. So the fact that I even did a sample is so exciting to me. And that we could defend it. So what we're hoping to do is to compare native households down in the steppe with households that were originally from the steppe who were pastoralists in the previous generation, and then compare them with natives in the steppe who were not pastoralists, and then new immigrants, and sort of set up different subgroups and see if you could detect a difference. Now, to me, this is just kind of complementing another more critical analysis. This isn't necessarily telling us analytically something incredibly new, but hopefully it's a way to start getting at these large scale, relatively large scale, it's a region, it's not national, ways of moving land, managing populations and land in a way that completely circumvents sort of juridical frameworks, and even in certain respects formal state apparatus. And if you can sort of trace that on this scale, I think it could yield some interesting insights. We're also doing a sort of GIS analysis because I have aerial photos from 89, 97, and then contemporary ones where I have someone who's digitizing the sort of different land categories like buildings. I call them gardens just because they call them Jnan, the agricultural field. And then what I call enclosures are those sort of adobe walls that are basically land claims. And over time we can see, how many of those enclosures were converted into buildings or urban agglomerations versus agriculture. And so that will give us another perspective to complement the sort of ethnographic and other ones. So, this is not a real analysis, but this is what we have so far, is that we've seen this is between 89 and 97, there was a big increase in enclosures, and I'll conjecture to say that's mainly for kind of urbanization, because even though there's extension of agriculture, and it's really significant for people, the overall land area is pretty teensy. So that's kind of where I am. The interesting thing about this is that our conclusions are basically that this was a livelihood and land use transition that was, I don't know about the term fairly well, but it was a managed one. It's a highly inequitable one, though. We need to be clear. This is not about equity, but this is a fundamentally exclusionary land tenure system. But to be honest, the collective land tenure system was always fundamentally exclusionary. And we would be wary of taking a sort of romance of the commons and assume that because it was collectively owned, it was also accessible. It wasn't. Both racially and in other ways, many people were excluded from enjoying those access to resources. So this was not the kind of chaotic appropriation of land that you hear many sort of official discourses around collective lands say. It's that there's this chaotic appropriation. It wasn't chaotic, it was in fact managed. Whether it was managed equitably is another question. And it helped to sustain, in many ways, the central importance of agriculture in most people's livelihoods. And it was, in fact, more than secure enough to allow households to make these sustained investments in land. There are basically no loan facilities here in any formal sense. There's no real formal credit. This was all funded through remittances and various informal credit arrangements. So thank you very much. Yeah.